everyone, and welcome back to another book review. Today I am going to be reviewing A Boy and His Dog by Harlan Ellison. This was in the year 1970, both the winner of the Nebula Award and a finalist for the Hugo Award in the category of Best Novella. So this is a novella. And I read this story in a collection of award-winning stories by Harlan Ellison called The Top of the Volcano. So this is the book I'm going to hold up, but I did only read A Boy and His Dog in this collection. And if you have this collection, it is on page 39, or that's where it starts. So I'm going to talk about the plot, what you can expect from this book, or the plot of this book, and then we're going to get into my thoughts on this book or novella, because I have many thoughts on Harlan Ellison and this book. So A Boy and His Dog opens up with a boy whose name is Vic and a dog who is telepathic whose name is Blood. Dogs in this universe, or which is a variation of Earth in the future, are telepathic due to previous experiments involving dogs and dolphins. And so dogs now have a telepathic link with I assume, their owners. The world that we find Vic and Blood in is very different from our current world. There has been some sort of nuclear apocalypse, and the world above ground, we'll get to that comment in a moment, is very, very different. It is an incredibly violent place, and it is run primarily by groups of gangs that each have different jobs, responsibilities, and sections. It is almost exclusively a male-dominated world. There are basically no women, and life is very violent, very aggressive, and you are not expected to live long is kind of my assumption. Vic, however, is not associated with a gang or any sort of group. He is what's called a solo, so he is doing life on his own in this complete wasteland of a world. The gangs do seem to have some working abilities with each other in that they will work with each other for a common good, but there does not seem to be any sort of functioning government or anything other than the mutual cooperation between these different groups of people, which again are almost entirely male. At the beginning of the story, Vic goes into town to go watch a movie. There are several movies put on by this group that manages the movie theater. That's kind of their territory. And, in the movie theater, Blood tells him that he has sniffed out a woman. And this intrigues Vic for a variety of reasons. And Vic decides to follow her to see where she goes, because women don't really exist on this upper world. He follows her to a broken down YMCA where he confronts her, but then gets into some sort of gunfight with rival gangs, and there's a bloodbath of a situation going on. Following this and Vic's subsequent connection to this woman, who he finds is named Quilla June, he decides to take up Quilla on her advice or her suggestion to go to the Down Under with her. So Quilla June is from the Down Under, and she has gone up to the surface. She is from these places which are basically sunk cities into the earth, where life is kind of kept at a static, I get the sense it's like 1950 small town ideal that is very different from the surface, but they are locked in and they are separate from the people living above. This is where we still have those families and communities living in these isolated, I guess, nuclear-proof bunkers, and they've created their own artificial ecosystem and life down there to continue life as before. When Vic gets down in the Down Under, he is brought before a group of people, and he quickly learns that Quilla June wasn't necessarily 100% honest or forthright with her assumptions or with her communication with Vic. And Vic, I guess, kind of assumed maybe a little bit about her, and instead he learns that she was brought to the surface to lure someone down into the Down Under city, which she's from, which is Topeka, and his job is now basically to fertilize women. That's the only way I can describe it. Basically, they're having an infertility issue, and they're hoping to bring some, for lack of a worse term, fresh blood. So now Vic is kind of in a weird situation where he kind of has unlimited access to something he's been desiring and craving, female companionship and women, and a lot of women who he's being forced to interact with, we'll just say it like that. And also a complete safe environment where everything is controlled and managed and there's no violence that was present in the outside world, but also there's no excitement, there's no adrenaline, and he's kind of constrained by this governing board of people in this down under facility. So now he has a choice. Does he stay? Does he go? What's his relationship with Quilla June? And how is this going to play out in the final pages of the novella? So I'm going to leave it at that for the review of the plot, because you can read it. Of course, being a novella, it's like 50 pages, so it's quite a quick read. And now we're going to get into my thoughts on this book, because I have many. Going into this, Harlan Ellison was on thin ice. I have not actually read anything by Harlan Ellison. I know one of his more famous works is I Have No Mouth, But I Must Scream, or something like that. But apparently A Boy and His Dog is the one that he's almost most well known for, which is surprising that I hadn't heard of it. But Harlan Ellison, for me, I have had one previous slight interaction, not truly interaction, but glancing blow with, and that was when I read Philip Jose Farmer's Riders of the Purple Wage in the anthology Dangerous Visions, which was edited by Harlan Ellison. And I did not like that book. I did not like that novella, I should say, Riders of the Purple Wage, or was that a novel? I didn't like it either way. And I also was kind of suspect of the whole Dangerous Visions anthology. Not saying it's like a bad, and we'll get to that in a second. I wasn't feeling Harlan Ellison if this was the kind of content that he enjoyed putting in collections. It seemed to be a collection that was designed to shock readers, and I don't really like shock value sort of content. So I was already feeling kind of about Harlan Ellison, and this was the first novella that I read by him, or the first anything that I read by him. This was a very violent novella. This is very, very violent in nature and of a variety of types of violence, and there's quite a bit of dark content that is discussed in these 50 pages of the novella. I think you can kind of assume when society goes under in Earth, things get rather violent rather quickly, but this just seemed exceptionally violent. And also the main character was very hard to sympathize with because he himself was a very violent, and I believe the Wikipedia article used the word amoral character. And I agree with that assessment, because I went to the Wikipedia article because I wanted to see if anyone felt the same way that I did. It is a very violent novella, and he is a very violent main character, and I feel like it's very, very hard to sympathize with anything that he does. However, I don't think it's wrong to write a novella where you have an amoral main character. I don't think that's a bad thing to do, but I just find it very hard to sympathize with characters like that, and therefore I kind of am one step removed from the whole story. The world seems like a cold, dark place, and it really begs the question in this novella, what happened to the world? And that's where I learned that this book is actually part of a group of 3, I think, other novellas, which kind of explain what happened to the world around it. There does seem to be some sort of nuclear disaster. So it could be read on its own because I felt like I understood everything I needed to for this book, but it could also be read as part of this greater novella. I think that one thing that you're going to see very quickly in this novella is the influence it had on the Fallout series. If you have any familiarity with the Fallout series, I think what's very obvious to me are these nuclear fallout shelters sort of things, and also mutants in the world around. There seems to be a lot of little connections that I was kind of picking up on, and a brief glance at the Wikipedia article confirmed my suspicions. There was an influence on the Fallout series, so that is something that I think, despite everything I didn't like about this book, the world building probably stood out the most, just because he created such an interesting and unique post-apocalyptic landscape where things went really wrong and the world became a very cold, dark, violent place, that he has to be given credit for building an interesting depiction of what could happen post-nuclear apocalypse. I think this is a perfect example, this book, A Boy and His Dog, or this novella, I should say, A Boy and His Dog, is a perfect example of what happens when I can recognize that a writer writes interesting content. His writing style is quite good. He's a good writer, the actual craft of writing, and I can tell that it's had been quite an influential work. I believe the book was actually adapted into a film, which wound up winning a Hugo. In addition to the Hugo nomination, the novella won, and Hugo nomination that this novella had, and the Nebula, the other award that it won. So there's clearly a lot of hype around this book, and it was very influential, and it is well written, and it's quite interesting, but I don't like it as a reader. And I think those two things can exist at the same time, and they don't have to be mutually exclusive. I did not like this novella, but I'm not saying it's poorly written. I'm not saying it's not interesting. I'm not saying it wasn't an influential influence in sci-fi or things that came later, or the Fallout games, or other pieces of work that were written later. I'm saying it wasn't for me, but I can recognize all these other things. I'm also kind of not kicking myself, but I'm just thinking ahead. Harlan Ellison was nominated 4 times in the category of Best Novella for Hugo's, and I'm trying to read all of those. So I'm going to have to read 3 more pieces by him. So I think the more I read by him, the more I might form an opinion on Harlan Ellison. But I really, if this is his writing, it kind of tracks. He seems to be a very interesting, unique personality, and you could go read his Wikipedia page to get a full biography of this interesting man. I'm guessing a lot of his works are going to fall into that category where I can recognize his writing genius, his writing ability, his writing skills, while also not liking the book itself. However, I am going to read all of those that he has been nominated for, and I can see a lot of his work being influential. So I'm glad that I had the opportunity to read A Boy and His Dog, and even though it wasn't for me, I think it's important to kind of get a broader perspective of some of the things that were written and have had further influences in the science fiction / fantasy field. If you have read A Boy and His Dog and have any thoughts on it, if you're a Harlan Ellison fan and you love his controversial works, please let me know what you thought in the comment section down below. This is one of those books that I feel like is very influential and has had a lot of conversation about it, and I just have not been part of that. So I would love to hear people who have read the book and maybe have a fuller perspective of this book add their comments and add what they want to discuss in the comment section below. I love to receive your comments. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great rest